When Elizabeth finds herself at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's estate in Derbyshire, she has to admit that it is a property that justifies a degree of pride.
Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something.
This visit to Pemberley not only changes Elizabeth's view of Darcy to a more favourable one, but also ours as the reader. From this point on, we are all willing Elizabeth and Darcy to get together, and when it finally happens, as a result of Mr. Darcy's heroic salvation of the entire Bennet family, everyone is satisfied with the reward of a suitably happy ending. Of all Jane Austen's novels, Pride and Prejudice is the best known. Many film adaptations have been made, the story has been used for plays and even musicals. These have come and gone, each one reflective of the period of time it was produced in, but Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy remain. It's been suggested that Darcy is little more than a device to get Elizabeth well married, but having considered the general public's reaction to more recent productions, Mr. Darcy certainly still manages to set female hearts aflutter. As for Elizabeth, Jane Austen says,
I confess I think her as delightful a creature as ever appeared in print, and how I shall be able to tolerate those who do not like her, at least, I do not know.
The fact that readers today continue to fall in love with Elizabeth is testimony to Jane Austen's skill as a writer. Northanger Abbey, although not the next novel to be published, logically belongs to the group of 3 novels drafted while Jane was living at the rectory at Steventon. It was not published until after Jane's death in 1817, but ironically it was the first work that she sold. In its original form, the manuscript was sold to the publisher Richard Crosby for £10 in 1803. Then titled Susan, the novel failed to appear in print, really disappointing Jane. As time went on, her disappointment turned to dislike of Mr. Crosby, and this became even worse when she inquired after the fate of Susan. Mr. Crosby, apparently, with little consideration for her feelings, answered that he was not in any way bound to publish it, and if she didn't like it, she could buy it back for £10. She didn't take him up on this until 1816, when Henry supervised the purchase. By this time, she had experienced considerable success with her other titles, but as this had been anonymously, Crosby had no idea of the value of what he was selling, and Henry Austen was wise enough not to enlighten him. At this time, Jane Austen revised the manuscript as far as she could, but a great deal of time had passed and a great many changes had taken place since its origins in the late 1790s. George III, who was on the throne for the whole of Jane's lifetime, had become ill in 1788. We now know that the poor king was suffering from porphyria, which, with the benefit of hindsight, explains his very disturbed behaviour. Unfortunately, the physicians of the day translated this as madness, and his son, the indolent Prince George, used this against his father to try and take power, succeeding with the passing of the Regency Act in 1811. Britain had been at war with France since Jane was 17, and she was nearly 40 when it ended with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. With 2 brothers in the Navy, Jane was very aware of what was going on, hearing much about Napoleon, and no doubt much enjoyed hearing news of Nelson's victory over him at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. The French Revolution had shaken the aristocratic order of Britain, as had the loss of the American colonies in the American War of Independence. The egalitarian propaganda that started to appear was living proof that an aristocratic hierarchy was not the only way to run a country. This, combined with our own industrial revolution, was making for great change in the British social landscape. Northanger Abbey begins in the imaginary Wiltshire village of Fullerton. Catherine Morland, our unlikely heroine, is the daughter of a clergyman and one of 10 children. Here Jane was writing from experience, as she undoubtedly is doing in this extract. This green slope is at the site of the rectory in Steventon, where Jane would have played as a child.
What a strange, unaccountable character. For with all these symptoms of profligacy at 10 years old, she had neither a bad heart nor a bad temper, was seldom stubborn, scarcely ever quarrelsome, and very kind to the little ones with few interruptions of tyranny. She was, moreover, noisy and wild, hated confinement and cleanliness, and loved nothing so well in the world as rolling down the green slope at the back of the house.
Catherine's love of dirt soon gives way to an improved complexion and curling hair. Then she's fortunate enough to be taken to Bath as the companion of Mrs. Allen, mistress of the chief property in Fullerton. Soon after arriving in Bath, she meets Isabella Thorpe, and they greatly enjoy each other's company, reading novels and sampling the delights of Bath. Bath provides the hero necessary for Catherine to fall in love with, and he's rather pleasant. Henry Tilney is handsome, clever and very sensible. When Catherine visits Northanger Abbey, his family home, a Gothic horror of a property, she allows her novel reading to influence her judgment. Catherine's imagination runs away with her. General Tilney, Henry's father, is a good old-fashioned snob. The only reason he's invited Catherine to visit Northanger Abbey is because of a report that he's heard about Catherine's rich family. When Catherine hears of the very sudden death of Henry's mother, coupled with mysterious locked doors, it causes Catherine to jump to the conclusion that the general has done away with his wife and hidden her body somewhere in Northanger Abbey. Jane Austen used the device of the Gothic novel to inflame Catherine's imagination. The Gothic novel, usually a tale of the macabre and supernatural, inevitably set in haunted castles, graveyards, ruins or wild countryside, was at the height of its popularity in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Some Gothic novelists even went as far as to build houses based upon their Gothic fantasies. Strawberry Hill at Twickenham being a prime example. Henry has all the traits of a classical young man who disapproves of Gothic novels like Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho, but uses his sense of balance to understand Catherine's hysteria.
Dear Miss Morland, consider the dreadful nature of the suspicions you have entertained. What have you been judging from? Remember the country and the age in which we live. Remember that we are English, that we are Christians.
General Tilney knows nothing of Catherine's suspicions, but hears from the same source that told him of Catherine's richness that Catherine is in fact very poor. The general virtually throws her out of Northanger Abbey, never to darken their doors again, and forbids Henry to see her. Henry loves Catherine too much to let her go, follows her home and proposes. In the end, the general is mollified by the marriage of his daughter to a peer, and the proof that Catherine was not as poor as he thought, as both reports of her financial status were as inaccurate as each other. The next 3 novels were completely created at Chawton Cottage, the house Jane Austen's brother Edward provided for the widowed Mrs. Austen and her daughters near Alton in Hampshire. They moved here in 1809, and the steady flow of publications continued, with Mansfield Park in 1814. Just as with Elizabeth Bennet's character being the backbone of Pride and Prejudice, we have a similar situation in Mansfield Park. Fanny Price is the substance of Mansfield Park. Here, though, is where the similarities end. We meet Fanny when she's only 10 years old, an interesting development for Jane Austen, exploring her heroine at a younger age. The Victorian novelists who followed Jane Austen's lead used this technique very well. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and George Eliot's Maggie Tulliver in Mill on the Floss, to name but two. Fanny has been sent from her poverty-stricken family in Portsmouth to be brought up by her rich relations, Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram, at Mansfield Park in Northamptonshire. This is a situation Jane Austen actually had first-hand experience of, as her brother Edward had been adopted by rich relations who had no children of their own. Although this may have seemed a perfectly logical solution, as Jane's family had more mouths to feed than they could manage, young Edward must nevertheless have been awestruck by the huge estate he arrived at in Kent. Jane Austen perhaps expresses these feelings when Fanny arrives at Mansfield Park.
The grandeur of the house astonished but could not console her. The rooms were too large for her to move with ease. Whatever she touched, she expected to injure, and she crept about in constant terror of something or other, often retreating towards her own chamber to cry. And the little girl who was spoken of in the drawing-room when she left it at night, as seeming so desirably sensible of her peculiar good fortune, ended every day's sorrows by sobbing herself to sleep.
Unlike Jane Austen's brother, who was the only child in the new household, Fanny has cousins to contend with. Tom, the eldest, is 17, Edmund is 16, and they are followed by the Miss Bertrams, Maria and Julia. As Fanny grows up, it is Edmund who forms a special friendship with her, as he's very kind. He helps her to write home to her beloved younger brother William, who has joined the Navy. When William gives Fanny a little amber cross, it is Edmund who provides the chain for her to wear it upon. These crosses were given to Jane and sister Cassandra by younger brother Charles, who of course was also in the Navy. It is accepted that William Price is based on Charles Austen. The consequence of Edmund's kindness is Fanny's undying love and devotion to him. Fanny is a very good girl, who grows into a serious young woman. A sense of duty is a very strong motivating factor, and as with Jane herself, she's constantly juggling the principles of love, money and duty. She is a very stark contrast to her cousins Maria and Julia, who lack Fanny's moral fibre, which in Maria's case causes her to come to a bad end. Jane Austen uses the clever device of the cousins performing a play within the plot of the novel. Friends of the family, the charming Henry Crawford and his beautiful sister Mary are enlisted for the cast, as is Maria's fiancé, Mr. Rushworth. They choose to perform Lover's Vows by Mrs. Inchbald. Fanny wants no part of it, and the Bertram girls behave atrociously. True to Fanny's prediction, all ends in tears. As the story proceeds, Edmund falls under the spell of Mary Crawford, and Fanny is pursued by the rakish Henry Crawford. When Henry proposes, the Bertram family become very angry with Fanny when she refuses him. They think it her duty to marry him despite his improper behaviour with the engaged Maria. It is interesting to speculate here that the goodness of Fanny could have saved Henry Crawford, as could Edmund have helped Mary. Fanny sticks to her guns, and Henry, true to form, runs away with the now married Maria. When Mary Crawford refuses to condemn her brother's actions, Edmund realises the flaws in her character. Enter stage left, good, faithful Fanny, whose determination to do what is right is rewarded by a proposal from Edmund. Mansfield Park was published, like Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, by Thomas Egerton. On the 9th of May 1814, he placed this advertisement in the Star. Mansfield Park, a novel, in 3 volumes, by the author of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. It must have been disappointing to Jane Austen when the journals were silent. There were no reviews, and although some people found the novel entertaining, even members of Jane's own family had difficulty liking Miss Fanny Price.